with crises, critical research into states, ecologies, and societies, research hub at Maynooth University. My name is Rita Sakr. I'm assistant professor in postcolonial and global literatures and coordinate the MA in Literatures of Engagement in the Department of English. Before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Claire Gallien, I have a few reminders for everyone. This Zoom webinar is being recorded. After the talk and initial conversation, Maynooth University attendees will be brought into the discussion with panelist function and can unmute themselves to ask questions, while attendees from outside MU can use the chat function. I am delighted to welcome virtually Dr. Claire Gallien, who is Senior Lecturer in English Studies at Université Montpellier 3. She has been engaged with teaching and researching Arabic languages and literatures for most of her career. Her wide-ranging research is grounded in the critical study of Orientalist discourse, postcolonial, comparative, world literatures and theories, as well as translation studies and decolonial theory and practices. Her current book projects are a monograph titled From Corpus to Canon, Eastern Literary Traditions and Orientalist Reconfigurations in 17th and 18th century Britain, and a co-edited volume on Islam and New Directions in World Literature. This co-edited volume emerged after Claire was invited as Edward Said Fellow to spend the fall semester of 2017 at Columbia University, and there met with Dr. Sara Bintir, with whom she organized as recipients of the Global Research Grant at Columbia, a colloquium in 2018 on canon creation in Arabic literature. Claire's work has been published in Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Journal of Commonwealth Literature, and Translation Studies, among others. She was also guest editor of a special issue on refugee literature for Journal of Postcolonial Writing, and also on contemporary Anglo-Arab literature for Commonwealth Essays and Studies. Claire, like everyone here, I'm very much looking forward to hearing your talk that is titled Born-Heterolingual Texts, Anglo-Arabic Writing and the Practice of Worldliness.
Okay, so can you hear me properly? Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this these kind words, very kind invitations. So I want to thank Maynooth University, the Department of English, the Research Seminar Series for the kind invitation. My words of thanks go also to Tracy is here and who really facilitated this meeting for us, and to Rita for her kind invitation. So just a couple of words, you know, in introduction and just to set the scene of this talk. So Rita and I met, or rather I met with Rita at ACLA back in 2017 at Utrecht University, when Rita gave a fascinating presentation on migrant narratives, and so Rawi Haj and Hassan Blassim, the Iraqi Christ. So we missed each other after the talk, but then I wrote back to Rita, invited her to actually to a contribution to this special issue Rita was talking about on refugee literature. And so then we kept in touch, really. I was supposed to come and join you today at Maynooth, but then here you go. I mean, we're all now online for at least a couple of months. So my presentation today, okay, is based so most likely end of this year, titled Multilingual Literature as World Literature. So this volume is edited by Wen Chin Huyang and Jane Hiddleston. So the presentation today is based on it. It's not exactly the chapter. You'll find more or less in the chapter itself, more and less, and more. But so for today, my title is Born-Heterolingual Texts, Anglo-Arabic Writing and the Practice of Worldliness. So I will start by saying that at this juncture in time, English is still the dominant language that many authors aspiring to world recognition writes in, or into which they should at least be translated. Yet there are two ways for English to circulate in the world. One is by being global, and the other one is by being global, and the other is by becoming worldly. So contrary to the global paradigm, which has a blunting or homogenizing effect on all literatures, the worldly paradigm has an enhancing potential through greater complexity and creativity. By attaching themselves to other languages, other scripts, other forms, other genres, other literary traditions, other perspectives, and I could go on, other cosmovisions. In other words, by performing acts of what Edward Said conceptualized as affiliation, as opposed to filiation, works in English become what I call enmeshed formations. Obviously, these witting and unwitting gestures of linking are not something new or specific to English. After all, it would be hard to find one type of literature that is not essentially intertextual. Yet imperial and national ideologies of the types developed in 19th century Europe have created fictions of purity in languages and literatures, and have rendered the English language and literature amnesic to their porosities, and to the fact that they are inhabited by the other. So building on Abdelkébir Khatibi's and Derrida's reflections in monolingualism, the monolingualism of the other, my paper thinks through the implications of considering English not as a language, and this is important, not as a language welcoming other languages or other tongues, other literatures in its midst, but as a born multilingual and born heterolingual language. In my presentation, I place Anglophone Arabic writing within the larger debate on world literature and multilingualism. Indeed, the novelists and poets I've selected possess or are possessed by multiple languages, i.e. Arabic, but Arabic in its classical form, also in its various vernaculars. You'll see that I'll talk about Iraqi, Palestinian, Syro-Lebanese, inhabited or possessed by English, other European languages, other minority languages such as Kurdish as well. For some, English is the language that they have always written in, and they reserve Arabic vernaculars for home or private exchanges. For others, English and Arabic are alternatively used, depending on the type of writing that they are engaged in. And for others, still Arabic is the language of writing, whether due to a lesser command of English or due to a positive and militant politics of language. For instance, Anan el-Sheikh, whom I'm not discussing in this presentation, but she's made her career as a writer in Arabic, refusing to write directly in English, while recognizing the influences of Russian, French, English, classical Arabic, and contemporary Egyptian literatures in her prose. So in this presentation, I will offer close readings of texts that engage in heterolingual practices of writing by breaking scripts. And so for this presentation, I will only discuss Dunya Mikhail. Breaking also the monolingual conception of language, and I will focus here on Suhair Hamad. And if we have time, breaking Orientalist representations encrypted in language use. And here I would like to look at one novel by Sinan Antoun. The conclusion that I draw is that the purpose of their practices is not to periodically hybridize language, or not periodically actually hybridize monolithic entities, be they script, language, or representation, but to dramatize the creative potentialities of the multilingual and heterolingual tongue. Their exploration of multi-heterolingualism acts as a shaping force configuring their texts. Ultimately, heterolingual writing showcases politically and aesthetically charged questions, such as, to whom does a language belong? Who has the right to define what a language is? What it should look like? How it should be spoken or written? So to give you a short presentation of the text that I will be discussing tonight, first of all, Dunya Mikhail is the Iraqi Knights, translated in 2014, is a collection of poems with drawings in it resembling ancient Sumerian tablets. And it also has the poet's handwriting in Arabic, so featured in, written into the tablets as well. The collection is initially written in Arabic and then translated into English. But in the English translation, the ancient Sumerian tablets and the poet's handwriting in Arabic remain. And they are essential to the creation of meaning. So that's my argument. Yeah, perhaps, yeah, so then so like I said, I won't talk about Beck's Do It poem, but I will move to Suhair Ahmad. I spend a bit of time doing that actually in the chapter. Suhair Ahmad is interesting for me because of the disruption of forms, contents, and also expectations that she creates. So the final heteronormative practice I intended to develop is one involving, like I said, breaking dominant representations and tropes. And this would be by comparing Sinan Antoun's Ya Maryam 2012 with its translation, The Baghdad Eucharist 2017. Both versions, so the Arabic and English, both versions of the not quite same text actually question the dominant discourse on Iraqi sectarian violence and war, but do not produce the same effect whether addressed to an English or an Arabic readership. The close readings I offer indicate that a text is not heterolingual by nature, and in that regard differs greatly from texts that are just published in bilingual format. For me, a text becomes really sort of, I'm interested in the process itself of becoming heterolingual by practice, and to highlight the political dimension of literature. So the term heteros, I spent really quite some time, again, in the chapter going into the details of heterolingualism. So because of time constraint, I'll just try to summarize my point here. The authors I'm looking at are not the only one to have been born and raised, or educated for that matter, in a multilingual diasporic environment. The question I'm asking then is, do they have a specific way to be multilingual? So by presentation, if you like, I'm arguing here that given the context in which they write and in which they read, their very multilingualism, Arabic, English, possesses a specific inflection. Indeed, When standard and vernacular forms of Arabic travel to the Anglosphere, their symbolic meanings change too. From being state-sponsored, state-enforced, so from being that, Arabic is turned into a language spoken by an ethnic minority, and it becomes the, I quote, language of the enemy as it crosses to the US and is associated with war and terrorism. I mean, you have to bear in mind that the authors that I'm looking at really write post 9/11, post 2003. So this is the context, really. So this association is not just the effect of individual statements by alt-right people declaring Arabic the language of the enemy. It takes place within what Foucault categorizes as a discursive formation. So it's a bigger discourse. Therefore, in the context of the global north, largely governed by neoconservative and neoliberal rhetoric, state rhetoric, and where Arabic would evoke within that discourse, within that discursive formation, anxiety, fear, suspicion, creating multilingually in Anglo-Arabic is in itself an act of resistance. So borrowing from Suhair Hammad's collection, Working Poems, Michel Hartman conceptualized so breaking English in opposition to the weakened and defeated version of what is known in post-colonial writing as broken English. By intentionally interrupting scripts, languages, representations, the authors of Anglophone Arabic writings not only break hegemonic structures of discourse, they also induce a shift of attention from signified to signifier, from representation to the materiality of words, grammars, and forms, which serve and support these representations. This shift is crucial in the case of post 9/11 Anglo-Arab and translated Arabic literature in the West, which has been persistently called to, quote unquote, represent Arab and Muslim identities, or to, again, quote unquote, witness and respond to contemporary geopolitical crises, and to abide by what Ghana and Herting called, and I quote them, the imperative to narrate violent events, to make them speak, and to make them speak coherently, to an order of credibility imposed from outside. In our case, it means that the publishing industry demands of Arabic writers that they write about terrorism, about wars in the Middle East, that they write about Islamophobia, that they write about Arab sexuality, about Arab women oppression. In other words, that they comply with a certain, set of expectations. To be clear, cultural productions do not have to be caricatural to repeat stereotypes. For instance, the number of films set in the Middle East or North Africa, produced by Arab film directors, and often women, focusing on the topic of female, social, familial, and religious oppression, is just alarmingly high. This is not, of course, absolutely not to deny the reality of violence, the reality and the violence of this issue, but to repeat that it is crucial to take into account the spaces of reception. So when circulated in the West and in Western states, self-described as secular, liberal democracies, the films repeat a monolithic representation, in this case of Arab women, which in itself is a very problematic category. So with the heroine where the heroine are either suppressed or oppressed or resisting. Therefore, the displacements that the poets I'm looking at, the displacements displacement of attention from signified to signifier, from content to form, constitute an option that the writers discuss have chosen in order to militate against this testimonial imperative that Ghana and Erting were writing about, and also to bring forward the issue of frames, the frames used to delineate the contours of representation. Therefore, I argue that the concept of heterolingualism, based on the Greek heteros, meaning other, another, different, is more relevant to analyze the action and effect of Anglophone Arabic prose and poetry than multilingualism. And I explain again in my chapter that I borrow this concept from Régnier and Myriam Suchet in French. So there is a bit more on this again in my chapter. But I'd like now to really sort of look at the poems that I've been sort of referencing so far. So if we could, I think, move on to the first on the PowerPoint now. Okay, great. This was the indeed. Okay, thank you so much. So Dunya Mikhail, she's from the Assyrian Christian community in Iraq. She's an exiled poet who left the country in 1996 in the aftermath of the Gulf War and mounting harassment under Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. In the Iraqi Knights, she reflects on the power of poetry to confront and ward off death, the power of poetry also to reopen the wounds of war, and using poems to face and remember the violence, while at the same time restating the richness of Iraqi culture. Mikhail uses the brevity of poetry and the play with form that it allows in order to highlight both topics. For instance, and this is where we look at the slide now, the slide you have in front of you. In a very evocative, I think, designing of a poem, the poem is titled, by the way, A Half-Burned Page. A half-burned page on Al-Mutanabi Street. So in that poem, Mikhail adds large blank spaces in the line of the verses and between words, so as to create a visual representation of pages of books blown off by a bomb detonated on the on this most famous book market street, in Baghdad. And so I don't think I will even read the poem, because I think, like, at this stage, so as I said, this is the story of a bomb blowing off on the streets on Al-Mutanabi Street, and I think like this poem is to be read visually, this with the holes and between the words. Visually, the poems of Al-Layali al-Iraqiyya repeat this opening resistant gesture in presenting Mikhail's Arabic and written verses woven in and around drawings recalling Sumerian tablet. So what is interesting with the English translation is that it is there on the page, but placed in the upper left-hand corner. So set aside from the Arabic Sumerian dialogue that is going on in the visuals below. The page of the poem becomes a translation site where the interactions between different signs bears meaning, and meaning is drawn from that interaction. For instance, Arabic script, so if we take tablet number 1, yeah, for instance, Arabic script fuses in the form of the shell and becomes the shell in tablet 1. The poet also plays Arabic in the image and tell the same story twice through two different media, as in tablet 10. This is the next slide. Yeah. Language may be placed below the drawing as a form of translation for an image that cannot be cracked. It may also be absented from the visual, as in tablet 20. And I think this is the next one, tablet 20, or the last one. Yeah, this one. So what all these configurations reveal is that language and image, Arabic and Sumer, interact in various ways, ranging from intensification of meaning to diversion of meaning. And very crucially, that these connections are not natural one, but are one that are the result of a design. In other words, of a choice of where to place which of the two languages, or three sign systems, and what relation to privilege between these three. The presence of English in the corner highlights for non-Arabic speakers how the Arabic script, in spite of being visually interlaced with the drawing, may tell a very different story from it. So in the case of tablet 20, Arabic deploys the story, or rather a potential story, contained in the drawing, because readers are free to wonder if that is really the only story contained in the tablet, the only way to interpret it. Arabic poetry offers one potential translation of graph into language, of image into language. One translation that makes sense, but that obviously does not cover the image in its entirety. Indeed, when we look at tablet 11, for instance, so I think we'll have to shift back to tablet 11, yeah. Tablet 11, we have the husbands, so in the poem we have husbands that were lost and then found, also prisoners of war, which may be linked with the images drawn in the third and fourth rectangles. We also have a reference to the kite that took her in the poem, and that could be linked to the second rectangle. But then the rest of the poem in Arabic really does not relate to the visual, nor do the other three rectangles that you have in the visual find their language equivalents in the poem. So what is eloquently dramatized here is the act of translation itself as a form of drawing closer to another language, an imaginary, while recognizing what? The holes, the distances, the approximations, in other words, the absence of transparency. So now I'm moving to the second part of this presentation on Su'aila Hamad and her collection Breaking Poems, which includes, but is not restricted to, the topics of violence and the displacement, the violence of displacement and war. So obviously the various ways in which she breaks the English grammar and language recall the post-colonial literary experimentation of Creole and hybrid English. It would be absurd to negate this potential, this post-colonial affiliation, given the colonial context of Palestine, to which Suhair Ahmad is historically, culturally, linguistically, and emotionally connected. Yet, her Breaking English achieves something more than broken English. It permits the materialization of violence in language. Ahmad's Breaking Poems are an important gesture of poetic refusal to approach global violence and to approach Palestine with a language and a posture that would remain safe, unaffected, untainted, unbroken by the violence happening on the ground. So there are two poems that I'd like to look at with you. One is Break Face. It's a poem composed at Qalandiya, so at the checkpoint. And so it recalls the experience of the poet going through the checkpoint. And from that experience, Ahmad remembers the silent tears that had left, and I quote, 2 lines across her face, her break face. And a poem also. A poem, interestingly, shorn of its punctuation marks and of its conjugated verbs as well. So we should be moving to the slide that comes after the tablets. If we can do that. This is Galandia. So after the tablets, yes. After this one. Yeah, exactly. Fantastic. So you see at the top of this slide, the quote from the poem. So let's read it together. Grenandia, ahead, a family, 4. So quiet, their absence, alert, walk, forward, away, permission denied, hospital slip, a father, blind, thigh, 4, hand, son's shoulder, boy. What? 4. Who? 5. The mother holds a baby. Low, whimper, in blanket, non-violence is another's dream, a haunting map, projected onto body memory, where men done what they been, a blueprint of flight, sun, of spare parts of wetlands, open, women, sea, loss, waves, voices, bass, mirror, my face, the road map, the pieces plan, the partition through. The scene of routine violence refuses to be turned into a smooth narrative. And this is the whole point of a poetry, this refusal. Instead, a poem destabilizes grammatical categories. What I mean by that is that in a number of places, the words may be read simultaneously as nouns and as verbs, and destabilizes, therefore, readers' expectations. For instance, if you take the last line, roadmap may be heard, and she also plays a lot with that, of hearing and reading, the disjunction that may happen between the two. So it may be heard as a compound noun, depending on how you read it, the word map. But then most likely read as maybe read as a noun followed by a verb. But that verb, the road map, would be map, you know what, would be unconjugated though. In other words, the reader is left with either of two unsatisfactory options. Either you have roadmap heard as a compound noun, but then misspelt because it's supposed to be written in one block, or you respect the syntax. You have, you know, road and map separated, but then as a noun and as a verb, and as a verb, but then you have to recognize that there is a grammatical error somewhere. The point is not to decide on the matter, but precisely. So the point is not to decide, to come to a decision, conclusion, but to precisely to remain in that unpleasant state of indeterminacy. And this is a minor form, of course, of the type of contingent life experienced by people living on the checkpoint and having to cross the checkpoint to survive. The same is true with a pieces plan, being most likely a noun followed by a verb. So much so that the reader feels guilt in having or trying to stabilize and fix meaning, because that would defeat the very purpose of the poem. The repetition of the plosive P at the end translates into sound the violence of partition, and the last proposition through, a proposition denoting a movement, so contrasts with that sort of stalling effect of the P, of this series of plosive, and it indicates a final cut. The final cut, you know, that movement, but that cut really through that history, that partition, also that militarized space have imposed on people's lives. Therefore, Hammad challenges our modes of reading, and this is not to imply that the disruption can in any way compare with the violence of Palestinian life under Israeli occupation, colonization, apartheid. But this is to insist on the fact that poetry and its readers cannot feed on the misery of others without going through some form of trouble, some form of destabilization. And in this case, the poetics of the break serves this purpose. Promises of peace, of roadmaps, the loss of land, and the wounds inflicted on bodies break the poem, and language returns, but it returns maimed. Right, and then I'll just end with two more short, cases in Suaid Ahmad. So the second one is the poem, starting with poem is my body, my language, my country. So basically here, Hammad breaks language with a language. That is, she not only breaks syntax, but she also interjects Arabic. So I was looking at, how she breaks syntax. Now I'm looking at how she breaks the Arabic. She interjects, Arabic into English, and English into her transliterated Arabic poems. So the Arabic introduced in the English, overall English poem, does not create exoticism. The words related to her Palestinian ancestry, but they also reproduce a natural way to talk between languages, swapping to Arabic for coordination and conjunctions such as and, which is consistently presented in its translated form as wow, and I, which is turned into ana. For instance, in last stanza, you have poem is my body, my language, my country, wa bas, ana, close to tourism, ana, close to journalist, wa bas, to translation. The poet while locating herself already in translation in between the two languages. Similarly, English breaks her Palestinian Arabic poem, so breaks into her Palestinian Arabic poem. So the last example, ما بعرف أكتب بالعربي, which ironically translates in English as I do not know how to write in Arabic. Her text, so her English Arabic poem is written with the letter ha, so as 7 and ayn as 3. And the use of 7 and 3 and the Romanized alphabet is not mere language play, but it underlines dislocation and estrangement. It is heterolingualism performed. Written during Palfest, so Palestinian festival. The poem contains segments of Palestinian voices she heard, not necessarily connected together, but voices of what they said to each other, to her, and about her. The poem holds together the intimate, because this is written in the way Arabic feels to her, and the collective in the form of these sort of fragmented myriad of voices. And so now I would like to play this recording of this poem. I will do it myself, and then I think I will end here. I have more to say on Sinan Antoun, but perhaps we can leave it for discussion because I'm aware of the time that I'm really sort of running late now. If that's okay with you, Rita.
Yes, that's fine, Claire. That's great.
Okay. So let me play just this. Okay, so it's 2 minutes.
And low is spelled L, or something like Baraf is spelled B3RAF. That's what it looks like. That's what it feels like. لو بعرف أكتب بالعربي بكتب شعر كبير وحلوة feminine on purpose. لو بعرف أكتب في العربي بكتب عن ام حسين بالأمعري على ظهر خالد وهو يساعد أب يحمل ابنه، وعن لون شعر آن ماري وكيف بلال بالجامعة، وعن زيارة حنان على بيت جوزها. لا بقدر أسجل اللي بسمعه، بكتب بإيد أختي في التراب. شو نسوي؟ زمان ما شفتك. You are welcome. سمعتي؟ أبوي يتجوز على أمي. شو نسوي؟ يا الله عليهم. رايح الصبح على جرزون. كريستال بالعبري كريشو. بعد لها المسج على بلوتوث. آخ يا سني. I went to jail 14 times. شو نسوي؟ اسمها ياسمين. I will not join you in Jerusalem, but please enjoy your stay. أهلاً وسهلاً. أنا بكتب بالسر. أنا بحلم أطلع. بتفكري ترجع فلسطين؟ شو زهقان هالدنيا؟ شو نسوي؟ طب ليش ما تستشفى شعرها زي العالم والناس؟ العيشة برا أحسن مش لا؟ مش You look biblical. شو؟ شعر بالإنجليزي؟ معقول؟ بحكي زيهم 100%. هوية هوية هوية. عروس بحر. كل العرب هيك. شو نسوي؟ قهوة. استشهد. We had a barbecue there last year. Now the wall. كيف شايفة حالها؟ كيف شايفة الوضع؟ H2 missing O. أعطيها كرز تمر هندي. شو صار في لبنان؟ شو بيصير بغزة؟ يا أختي شو نسوي؟ اغلي لك هالقهوة. اقعدي يما أنا بعلمك عربي.
Okay, so that's the end for me. For this presentation, and I'd be very happy to hear your questions, continue the conversation with you, so on and so forth.
Thank you, Claire, for this fascinating journey into Anglo-Arabic poetry. And I think that as far as technology allows us here, those of us who have panelist function can unmute ourselves for a few moments and respond to your brilliant presentation with a round of applause, but we'll wait for Tracy to admit everyone later after our conversation. So it's from me now and later from everyone else. I have so many questions on my mind, but I'm aware of time also, but we have to start somewhere. So with the start of your talk and Derrida and Abdelkébir Khatibi, I'm thinking of the relationship between Derrida's statement, je n'ai qu'une langue, ce n'est pas la mienne, I only have one language, it is not mine. That suggests a post-colonial articulation of this kind of paradoxical ownership and non-belonging. But at the same time, I'm thinking of Abdelkébir Khatibi's Amour bilingue as a decolonial project that sees potential in the horizon of a kind of promise, a productive possibility. He says, l'horizon d'une promesse, une possibilité productrice. And that's where the uncertainty and the playfulness of this linguistic encounter can possibly enable alternative forms of creative resistance. So both statements are set against historical contexts of colonialism and liberation struggles. But going back specifically to your talk, could you tell us more about the history of monolingualism and how it is related to nationalism and colonialism?
Right. So yes, thank you for your comments here, and yes, this question on monolingualism, because indeed, I mean, we're all talking about, you know, as though this idea of them, and Derrida was here also to deconstruct that, let's say conceptually, but it's an historical construction, and it's an historical construction also. You know, in English, we have to go back to 17th, 18th century, really, where you see the rise of, well, you know, the use of print, the rise of the book market, and the rise of the number of readers, and well, the sort of literary elite, cultural elite, deciding at some point that grammar would have, they would have to police, the grammar police the language, and police the uses of the language, and also sort of create a national language and national literature. I'm not the first one to talk about this, but we can also, if we want to look at this, from a different perspective, but Benedict Anderson wrote a lot about this, about imagined communities and how the two really went together, how you built a nation around and with a language, with a literature that sort of set itself against, other European countries, other European literatures. And very, very importantly, at this phase of formation, let's say, the idea was really to look at, to purify the language. The rhetoric of purification is there everywhere. And for me personally, I don't really work on this corpus, on Addison, Defoe, the Earl of Shaftesbury. They were early 18th century philosophers who really sort of took this matter seriously. I look, for instance, at 18th century Orientalists and what were the conceptual frames they used when approaching, for instance, Sanskrit or Persian or Arabic or Indian vernacular languages, and why, for instance, Bengali was just like was just a nightmare for them, because precisely because it contained too many languages, and so it would have to either be purified or discarded. It's really a long history, and precisely contemporary writers are writing against that background.
Absolutely, it'll be a long discussion about that, but moving to the poetry itself, which is brilliant. So moving to Dunya Mikhail, she said this in a past interview. She said, "I always write in Arabic first and then try to translate this. So my writing goes from right to left, then from left to right." So in revisiting what you call born-heterolingual text from this specific perspective, so particularly Mikhail's work, do you see this translational movement in two directions on the page as one that maps a crossroads or a confrontation? Because you have been speaking about the possibilities of crossroads and confrontations throughout.
Right. So it's so we're looking here and talking here about the tablets, because obviously, if you look at the Iraqi Knights, the whole collection, it's a collection of different set of poems, and the tablets really a particular set of poems within the poems. And like I said, it's interesting because it interweaves the image, the script Arabic, and then the translation English. I was just thinking of the terms you were using, and I would say I would rather call it a crossroad than a confrontation. It's really not the way it feels like, and not the way it looks like, and not basically. It's interesting how, like, if you look at the picture, at the image, at the tablet, you have a narrative, and then you think the narrative is complete, you think you understood it, but then you realize there is a script interweave into that pictorial narrative, and then you see the script, the Arabic script, you think it replicates the image. It does to a certain extent, but it brings more or less, and there, then you go back to the picture and realize, in fact, the picture was telling you a story, but it was only a partial story, and it needed the Arabic sort of say something else, say things that it didn't say. And same with English, so it's a three-way movement. It's a point of interaction. It's a cross rather than a confrontation. Yeah, I would rather.
Thank you for that. I have to admit a particular love for Suhair Hamad's hip-hop aesthetics there. Going back to Breaking Poems, that memorable phrase, "Ana close to." Of course, it resonates in so many ways with respect to the dispossession of Palestinians, the marginalization of their voice, but also the resistance to media representations throughout. And in many ways, it is relevant to the blockade and Gaza. But there's also a sense of a paradox, I feel, because while the Arabic ana, I, is closed to being translated, it seems to open up onto the English and the poetic line, materially, physically. And so from this kind of perspective, in what ways do you think the heterolingual suggests a coincidence of closure and opening, as opposed to, for example, the translingual or the interlingual?
Yeah, so very, very interesting question. I think so. What's the differences that I'm trying to think through with these terms, heterolingual, multilingual, is really to assess the role of friction. So precisely what happens, what meaning is created when you place together on the same line ana closed to. That is, you say, you use two different languages. You do not translate from one to the other, but yes, you place them close together. It doesn't mean that there will be a passage, an easy passage. It doesn't mean that, again, it doesn't mean that it translates. But what's important is what is happening at this point of junction, be it friction or not. And precisely to me, what matters is really what meaning is created through saying ana, so that feeling of possession of the I, and precisely telling it in a language that is that one possesses, it feels like ana, I, and then opening it onto English. So realizing that one is placed in between these two languages. So it's both, it's closure, disclosure at the same time, and the very fundamental recognition that one is made of this multiplicity, of this multiple, and precisely realizing you put these two entities close together, and even if it does not apparently connects or instantaneously connects. I think there is a way to also think and read that poetry, in the sort of it'll be interesting to think in terms of temporality also. What happens when you read the poem? What happens when you think about it one day later? What happens when you see the performance and then read the poem and rethink about it? I mean, yeah, it's
and that's very much Suhair Hamad performing the poetry and also showing those gaps in temporality through that. I know that you wanted to speak about Sinan Antoun's breaking of Orientalist projections, but I'm going to transition into that through the questions from our attendees. And new attendees can unmute themselves and go on video if they like when they're asking questions. And in the chat function, we'll be getting questions from non-MU attendees.
Excellent.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Claire. Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. It was just mesmerizing to listen to you. My 2-year-old was also trying to drag me away half the time, so I'm not sure I caught all of it. But I really loved what you were saying. And although it's a slightly kind of new area for me, I work in poetic and visual kind of intersections. And something I'm looking at the moment as an Americanist is Layli Long Soldier's book, Whereas, which came into my mind quite often when I was listening to you, in terms of that kind of closure. You put it so perfectly, you know, the closure and the disclosure between languages, but also the kind of spaces between the languages that are used on the page. And Long Soldier, obviously, you know, she's part of the Dakota Indian tribe. She uses native Indian language in her own work, as well as English, and a lot of her work is kind of in that area of resistance and trying to find a kind of sense of belonging in either one or both. But there's a lot of kind of visuality of her poems as well. You know, she moves the words across the page. And as I was reading one of the texts that you put there on the slide about road maps, it struck me at how many different routes you could actually take through the poems themselves. You know, through the words, through the gaps between the words. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the kind of visuality of the poems on the pages, and how kind of, you know, space works alongside text.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Also the okay, I have to say that's why I'm mad. I think really it is worth listening to her, and I think she's a really performing poet. So a lot happens in performance, and it's interesting how she plays with ways of reading, and she plays with a gap all the time. So there is a way you as a reader would read the poem, then you listen to her and you realize that you completely misread it because she's putting the, you know, she's putting the stops, you know, in places where you hadn't put them, and that changes meaning. So that idea, I think, of fluctuation, of incomplétude, we'll say in French, you know, the incompleteness is really fundamental. And this is just to sort of, I think, emphasize once more, that we're not in a system where, I mean, like we have this dream actually, or this sort of meta narrative where everything is sort of that we are in control. And their poetry really sort of emphasize how, you know, we have to sort of come to terms with the idea of control, and precisely the gaps are there to sort of remind you that, because we have, like, when you read a sentence, you're in control of that, you're in control of the reading, you have a syntax, you have expectations, and, you know, it sort of flows. Perhaps you lose this sense of control when you start learning, you know, foreign languages, which is why foreign languages are so important to the way in which sort of we also grow but so yeah, so these gaps are there precisely when to indicate that that sort of lack of control of the mother tongue, of the tongue that should look not foreign. It's placing these holes in the map. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I really feel this is absolutely crucial. And this is why also you remember when I put this slide on from Dunya Mikhail's poem. Mm-hmm. I said at the end, I won't read it, I'll just look at it and look at the holes, because to me, I mean, I'm not saying one cancels the other, but I'm saying really the two modes of reading are valid. Mm-hmm. So I won't say don't read the poetry, because she wrote a poem in the end. So I guess it should be read, but I also guess it should be looked at.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Yeah, no, I'd love to talk more to you about this, but thank you.
Thank you so much for your question.
I know that there's a question from Rima about Sinan Antoun, because we've been talking about Sinan Antoun.
Hi Claire, thank you for the wonderful talk. I know we didn't get a chance to discuss Sinan Antoun. I was wondering if you could briefly
talk about what you were going to talk about in your presentation. Antoun, for me, is a very interesting writer, a contemporary Iraqi writer, in that he writes and publishes in Arabic, but he has translated his works himself into English in the past. And I know the work that you were going to discuss, Ya Maryam, or the Baghdad Eucharist, he did not translate.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
maybe I can try, and it's always very difficult to summarize what one wanted to say, but I think so. Maybe I'll try to do that, and we can take it from there. Perhaps there are other, then questions that may emerge. Or so basically, I was interested to look at this. So Ya Maryam, the Baghdad Eucharist. And I was looking at the structure of these novels and how. So the question I was looking at the ways in which the use of frames in the narrative and use of pictures and frames, because the Baghdad Eucharist. So you have the story, and you have stories within stories. And stories open as the narrator looks at a picture and then from that picture, like a scene of a family at a dinner table, whatever is in the picture, is the occasion to develop sort of a new narrative. So I was interested at looking at the ways in which these frames are a way for him to sort of think about anamorphism and the question of perspective and positions, and how, depending on which language you use, it's getting unstable, and so I don't know where we lost this thread and what I was telling you about. Maybe I was talking about pictures and the need to recognize, the importance of positionalities, and so maybe I'll start from there again. But so basically. So I was looking at the novel tells, stories of members of the Iraqi Christian of an Iraqi Christian family, and these stories from that family emerge from pictures, and so with these various threads, these various stories, so basically from each, then you get the description of the same reality from the perspective of a different character. Okay. And these various, so with these various threads, Antoun is able to weave a tapestry of Iraq, where sectarianism appears as the result of global geopolitical decisions, and as something so that is directed from top down, and so he tries, and this is where heterolingualism comes into play, I think. There's a counter-narrative which is offered here by the fiction, and that counter-narrative is one that undermines the depiction of Iraq as monolingual, mono-religious, monocultural. And this narrative is addressed primarily to Arabic speakers in Iraq and in exile, who are either supportive victims of this sort of global Islamic State propaganda, undermining Islamic diversity, precisely. And I was looking at, so in my paper, I was hoping to look at section 6 in the novel, because section 6 is remarkable because it brings together various soundscapes. I hope the connection is working properly now, that you can hear me. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it brings together different soundscapes. So the scene in section 6 of the book starts with Yusuf walking towards a little grotto where there is an enclosed statue of the Virgin Mary, and this is in a church in Baghdad. The protagonist then notices that there is a palm tree, and then recalls how the palm tree grew since his last visit. And this vision, this remembering, brings, happiness to his heart, feels to him that the tree is protecting Mary, etc. This Christian ancestry does not prevent him from appreciating also at the same time, while he's walking, through the church, appreciating Quranic verses that he overhears. And so on and so forth. There are many sort of, voices and sounds intersecting at the same time in that section of the novel. It's very interesting because the idea is not to cancel one voice. The idea is not to sort of merge the voices, but the idea is to sort of keep the voices together contrapuntally, and actually realize that, it works. So yeah, so there are, different parts of the novel. I'm not looking at the entire novel, but parts here and there where the question of heterolingualism comes into play, and the question also of anamorphism as well. And I'm sorry if the connection was unstable and we lost touch at some point.
That's great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
Becky says that she heard Sinan Antoun talk about how he had found the process of translating his novel traumatic, going over again the traumatic subject matter. And that is why he later decided to let someone else translate his novels. And it's a very suggestive statement, and very much relevant to those steps, and either cancelling or merging as a threat that you have to confront.
Very interesting. I didn't know about that, but yeah, Sinan is quite vocal about also this notion of having to represent Arab literature, and is very vocal, against that as well. The fact that you have one novel in a year, and that's what Arab literature is about. So I don't know. Perhaps Becky knows this, but perhaps there is also a gesture of, I don't know, writing in Arabic first and foremost, and then also, I heard, and this is, I'm trying to sort of think, as I talk, that there's also the case that his novels, there's space where the novel in translation in English does not fully or is not an exact translation of the Arabic. And I know many Arabic writers doing that, just sort of using the translated version as a new text as well. Again, with this sort of gesture or caution against closure. Like, it feels like every moment there is a feeling that there is a closure there, then it's trying to escape somewhere else where, yeah, so it's a strategy, perhaps.
It's a fascinating point on translatability and untranslatability, given the fact that, for example, there's Jonathan Wright now for contemporary Iraqi literature, somebody who knows the ins and outs of the language and the literary traditions. But then you have someone like Sinan Antoun collaborating with Jonathan, or sometimes translating himself at other times, being quite traumatized by that passage, by that crossing between Arabic and English. Do you see that in the Palestinian poetry too? In the Palestinian literature more generally, or more specifically Zuhair Hammad's case? Are there such cases of resistance to translating the text into a version in the other language that really mirrors the first, and creating a kind of gap intentionally between the translated version and the original?
It's very difficult to have, you know, a generalized. I think we really have to look into details here, and your question is you know, a question that demands a detailed answer, I think, because we're looking at, you know, again, we're talking Arabic, but we're looking at so many different authors from different contexts. Zuhair Hammad is really writing between the different languages, and also borrowing from hip hop and black music, black jazz music. She's, you know, really at the crossroads of many influences. And Sinan Antoun is different, because he's really like writing. It's not even post-traumatic. It's like the war is there, and it's just, you know, been forced out of his country, or so. So there's I don't know, this idea of maybe yes, for confrontation that is perhaps more violent in the case of Sinan Antoun than Zuhair Hammad, who, you know, has lived in the US all her life, I believe. So it's a different position, but it's also so interesting and fascinating that we have all those, you know, options, and at the end of the day, realizing that it doesn't mean much to say, okay, this is, you know, Anglo-Arabic or Arab English, English lit, because, you know, it just blurs so many important, you know, distinctions between these voices.
Such a crucial point that you've just highlighted, and it relates to this hetero and heterolingual, this other that's there, the encounter with the other, that the displacement for one writer or the other happens physically, happens emotionally, happens linguistically, but some displacements are more forced than others, and that impacts the poetry itself. So in the case of Zuhair Hammad, having lived for a while in the United States, whereas that does not apply to Sinan Antoun, and it kind of complicates this issue of heterolingualism and encountering the other in language, owning and non-belonging, and all of these important questions when we think of this Anglo-Arabic writing and its performativity on these levels. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to thank you, Claire, for this fascinating journey into the poetic and the political intersections of English and Arabic. And I'm going to thank everyone here for your fine attention. Join us on 26th November at 4 p.m. for our next MU English Department research talk with Dr. Zelfa Faghali. She'll be speaking on archiving vulnerability, children's crisis texts at the US-Mexico border. And also join us, if you can, on the 30th November, 5 p.m. for a conversation with Gary Keane and Andrew McConnell on their critically acclaimed film, Gaza, an event hosted by myself and my colleague, Dr. Dennis Condon, in the Department of English. A final moment for a round of applause for Claire, to thank you for the talk and for the conversation. If everybody who's here can unmute themselves.
You're doing really
As many as the people who are ready to unmute themselves.
Honestly, thank you for this invitation, and for the opportunity to, in spite of it all, continue the interactions and the thinking, together. Most importantly, so thank you again.
Thank you, Claire.